Welcome back to Borderlines, the only show that takes you beyond borders. My next guest, well, it's Africa that we're staying in. So we've gone to the UK, we've talked Europe, we've crossed over to Palestine. Now we're coming back to Africa. 2 years after Sudan's descent into full-scale civil war, the country is in free fall. This is not just a clash of two generals, it is the unraveling of an entire state. In Darfur, the rapid forces have waged a campaign of targeted ethnic cleansing against Masalit, Zagwaya, and other communities. Scorched earth attacks, mass killings, and of course, satellite confirmed mass graves. The human toll is staggering. Over 10 million displaced. The largest displacement crisis on earth. Yes, you heard me right. 25 million of our Sudanese brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, 2/3 of the population are in need of humanitarian assistance, and less than a quarter of the UN's appeal funded. On the other side of that, you have regional actors from the UAE to Egypt. They funnel weapons, money, and political backing to opposing sides. The African Union and Arab League issue statements, the usual perfunctory, but they take zero action, no decisive action at all. International diplomacy remains fractured, too often excluding Sudanese civil society from the negotiating table. Sound familiar? Of course. So, my guest today, a sister, is an all-female show today, right? It's an all-female Borderlines. My guest today understands both the structural roots of Sudan's collapse and the possibilities for a just resolution. Kholood Khair is the founding director of Confluence Advisory, a think and do tank focused on governance, peace, and democratic transition. She has called Sudan's war and I quote, a crisis of international accountability and imagination, warning that Sudanese people are dying in the silence the world has chosen. With Kholood, I am going to be exploring the realities on the ground, the complicity of regional and global actors, the resilience of the Sudanese civil society, and what a credible Sudan peace-led process would look like. Kholood, welcome to Borderlines. Welcome to Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and hello to you and all your listeners.
Indeed, thank you so much. Where are you joining us from?
From London today.
Ah, excellent. Okay, welcome. A fellow Brit, should I say.
Yes.
Talk to me, before we go into the questions, you're Sudanese. And I think this is something that people often forget, right? Because, it's been going on for so long. We forget the strength, the beauty, the arts, the language, the literature, the living, the existence, the joy, the dance, the music of Sudan. As Sudanese, just kind of paint that for us, all before this ugliness began. Paint your home for us.
Well, Sudan is, as you know, no stranger to wars and very lengthy ones. But, aside from that, the wars often make the headlines. But as you so rightly characterize, aside from that, Sudan is a country with such a rich tapestry of histories. It is effectively, a broad swathe of the continent that really mirrors, I think, migratory roots in the continent. It mirrors the different cultures within the continent. It's a mix of Arab and Nubian and African and everything in between, those cultures coming together, being forged over centuries and centuries and centuries. And so you have, for example, Nigerian influences in the food. There's a man called Ireti who recently wrote a cookbook, and within that he looked at some of the origins of Sudanese food, and the Nigerian food suya often, it features very firmly in Sudanese the culinary landscape of Sudan and some other elements as well. And so it's just one of these countries with such an important role to play, I think, in Africa, and it has never been able to really do that. So you have 500, and 400 to 500 languages spoken in Sudan. You have many different people coming from different areas. You have people who trace their roots to Morocco, to Syria, to West Africa, all across the Sahel and West Africa, to, to sort of Kenya and further down, across, of course, to the Arabian Peninsula. And so you just have this wonderful melting pot of people who came together at various parts of Sudanese history and, tried outside of the government, outside of any sort of formal governance structures, to forge this national identity, one where supporting each other was important, one where community service was extremely important, one where people held together the fabric of society, really, despite all the circumstances, harsh climate, endless wars, etc. And so this is the Sudan that, most of us still cling on to, despite all the horrors that we're confronted with every day during this war.
Indeed. So now we have the framing of two generals. They call it the two generals. How dangerous is that framing in actually, unpacking and helping and even engaging? Because I think one thing that the world has failed Sudan in is to emotionally and mentally and psychologically engage with the pain of the Sudanese people and indeed the tears of the land. But those two generals framing kind of, it almost gives license to that, or permission, does it not?
Well, the thing about the two generals framing is not necessarily that it's completely wrong, it's that it's incomplete. And oftentimes media narratives are interested only in sort of a very easy to sort of tell story. And the two generals, we saw in the run up to the war. I was in Khartoum at the time, and we saw the very heated rhetoric between them. We saw the icy relationship between them. And that's how so many of us knew that a war was coming, that these two men who had, after all, led a coup together against the civilian government in 2021 were no longer on the same page. And that became a very dangerous situation for people in Sudan. So when this war started, it was very much led by these two gentlemen in these two different camps, or at least they appeared to be different camps. But really, they are still united in many ways. They don't want to see a democratic Sudan. They don't want to see a Sudan that is thriving and led by civilians. They don't want to let go of their ill-gotten gains, particularly all those riches they made throughout the years and now during this war. They don't want to face any kind of transitional justice of any sort, whether it's international justice or local national justice. And they really don't want to let go of their troops. They don't want to see any kind of security sector reform or military reforms of any kind. Integration has been such a difficult thing to speak about. And when this war started, I remember being in Khartoum and the first few days, first of all, there was, of course, shock. But people thought, hang on a minute, this is a war between two parts of the junta that violently unseated the civilian government at the time, and then also killed a lot of protesters in the aftermath. This has really nothing to do with us. We need to stay out of this war and see what comes of it between these two groups, the Sudanese Armed Forces led by General Burhan and the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, led by General Hemeti. And we will stand back. We know that this is not our fight. This is an intra-junta, inter-Sudanese security state war. And that's how it started. Of course, both camps, the SAF and the RSF, realized very quickly that they would have no support for this war unless they made it everybody's business. And the easiest way to do that, not just in Africa, but we've certainly seen this across the continent, is to make this war about ethnicity, even though this war is about so many other things. But if you look at the way people in Sudan speak about this war today, oftentimes the motivating factor about which side they support or whether they support a war in the first instance is because of the sense that they as an ethnic group are somehow under threat. And this goes across the board. And for me, people often say, there are people who are pro-SAF and pro-RSF. And I think that for me is the inaccuracy. There are indeed two camps in this war, but the pro-SAF and RSF people belong in one camp. They are pro-war. They see war as the main organizing principle. They see war as the main way they will get their interests met. The other camp is the pro-peace camp, or the no to war camp. And that, I think, is the majority of people. Even those who feel at some point that they have to take one side or the other, recognize that war is bad and they want it to end. There is famine. There are services that people haven't had access to. 80% of health facilities are out of commission. 19 million children haven't been to school for years. Whole generations of children have not entered education. Immunizations, just the usual stuff that people sort of have to do within their sort of lifetimes, and look after their children, look after their parents, livelihoods. All of that has suffered with the state collapse that this war has brought. And so I actually believe that, there are two camps, pro-war and pro-peace. And what we see here within this war is that, beyond, what started off as this issue between these two camps, between these two generals, very quickly mushroomed through the ethnic narrative into a much broader war that has created so many militias, that has brought in so many people now who carry guns as a form of safety, who carry guns as a form of creating livelihoods. Of course, it has spread beyond Sudan's borders into South Sudan, into Ethiopia, into Chad, into Central African Republic, into Libya. And these are all countries that are very, very fragile themselves, or at least politically unstable. So it's gone beyond that narrative of these two men starting this war. But of course, there's a huge element of this, and I'm sure we can get into this as well, which is the international or regional element. Every sort of country in the region, slightly further afield in the African region, particularly in the Arab region, has very vested interest in this war. And a lot of people, some people think they may have started this war, but whether they have or haven't, they have certainly made a lot of money from this war, and they have certainly positioned themselves to be able to sort of call the shots of what kind of outcome is possible.
I love the way you broke that down. You will be able to call and contribute on 0201 277 0993. Female line is 0201 465 7190. Or you can send your WhatsApp comments to 0809 597 5805. Kholood, and I'm glad you mentioned ethnicity and the fact that it's been framed as an ethnic war. I can't remember the name of our last guest that we interviewed on this topic.
Rachel Shabby, was it?
Yeah, and there you go. And one of the things that that we talked about was how there's this idea of, light-skinned versus dark-skinned Sudan, and how that in itself plays a part in all of this. And I mean, it's really quite scary. But I don't even want us, and I think the message you're sending out there is, look, we've got issues. Brothers and brothers are fighting. Sisters and sisters are fighting. Yes, that's identified. And I agree with you. Let's talk about those who are flaming that fight. Those who are feeding that fight. The UAE. The UAE, as they say in Nigeria, they have query. What query should we be sending to the UAE? Because the whole point of this is to interrogate those people, those who are funding and enabling this, war to go on and on. Talk to us about the part the UAE plays.
So the UAE plays a very key role. They have been, their position right now is that they're not involved in this war in any way except for through giving humanitarian aid, and they deny completely their involvement in terms of giving military support to the RSF. But we've had so many investigations by the New York Times, by the Wall Street Journal, of how the United Arab Emirates is using these humanitarian camps in Chad, which is to the west of Sudan, and in now South Sudan, which of course is just directly south of Sudan and was once part of the same country. They're using these humanitarian camps there effectively as a way of, one, providing sort of reconnaissance, homes for injured RSF soldiers, but also, as most importantly, gateways for weapons to come into the RSF. We have seen planes land into Niala Airport, which is in South Darfur state, and those planes have been tracked to come from the UAE or friendly countries to the UAE, or countries where the UAE has military camps, for example, in northern Somalia, in Bosaso. We have seen really from the outset of this war, from the first few months, and so many of us within civil society were saying this has immediately had a very externalized proxy element to this war, and calling out the UAE's position in its engagement in supporting the RSF especially. And that's through, they supported the RSF to commit genocide, they've supported the RSF now and before to starve people, especially now, the very acute famine that is taking place through the siege of the RSF in El Fasher, the last sort of stronghold against the RSF in Darfur. And they have been giving them political cover. As well. The UAE was providing weapons. The UN panel of experts reports has shown that there is credible evidence that the UAE was providing weapons to the RSF in 2023 when the UAE was part of the UN Security Council, very much against the UN's own arms embargo in Darfur that has been in place for about 20 years. And so that is the kind of, position, that is the kind of sort of behavior, that's the kind of policy that the UAE has had, although they continue to deny this. Recently, we have seen a shift. I think the evidence has gotten so much and so damning that they're no longer just denying it. They've also had to come out and try to sort of exonerate themselves and put forward, these kind of narratives that actually we're not involved. We're just trying to help Sudan. We're trying to seek a solution to this. But nothing on the ground suggests that that's the case. It's very, I think, important here to highlight a key development seen globally that also implicates Sudan. The Abraham Accords that came into place during the Trump administration, Trump's first administration, was not just signed by the UAE, but the UAE was a key architect in that in those Abraham Accords. And those accords were signed by Bahrain, Morocco, the UAE, and Sudan. Sudan was very much pressured by the Trump administration to sign those Abraham Accords in exchange for taking Sudan out of this state sponsor of terrorists. Now, the UAE's ability to now be seen as this preferred Middle Eastern partner by the West, chiefly by the US, because of the Abraham Accords, has effectively given the UAE this Teflon status that we see Israel also enjoy. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why they orchestrated the Abraham Accords in the first place. They wanted that Israel level of sort of impunity. And they now have it. I mean, we've seen accusation after accusation after accusation, credible accusations from credible actors against the UAE, well-founded and well-researched reports and investigations. And none of them have really made a dent in terms of how the international community continues to deal with the UAE. So you've seen the United Kingdom, declare trade deals even after civil society was raising the alarm about the UAE's role in the siege and starvation and the genocide that was taking place earlier this year. In April, you have seen the Biden administration make the UAE a preferred defense partner in the region. That's extremely high status. And we've also seen how the UAE continues to, to do trade deals. Donald Trump recently went on a sort of Middle Eastern tour, went to the UAE, signed a, 1.3 trillion with a T dollars worth of sort of business deals. And the UAE has now been given sort of, the ability to sort of set up a lot of data centers, which to me it intimates a lot of trust in the United Arab Emirates. And this goes despite the fact that there is all this evidence that has been mounting about the UAE's role in Sudan.
And it's interesting that you do mention that Abraham Accord, and I'm glad you did, is that, like you said, the UAE's role is no longer opaque, right? Everybody knows what they've been up to, what they're doing, and yet they're allowed to continue with it. Is there, you mentioned about Israel. In the UAE, you're not allowed to wave a Palestinian flag, for instance. It's legal. Is there such a thing? Does such a thing exist with regards to Sudanese flags? Is there Sudanese diaspora in the UAE that can actually maybe protest and challenge, or beyond that, globally? Because I think that's where we're getting to. We need that mass voice. We need people to be out on the streets. We need the pots and pans that's happening for Palestine to be banged for Sudan. Is that possible in the UAE or the UAE embassies across the world?
I would say two things about that. One, it's not possible to protest in the United Arab Emirates at all. Even nationals are not able to protest in the UAE, let alone those who are there because they are fleeing a conflict. So that's not possible. But the diaspora elsewhere has sort of picked up the banner here and tried to, have these protests quite regularly, particularly in the UK, in the US, etc. But I think we also need to see, it's very clear that the US and the UK are not going to necessarily move to a position very soon where they are going to publicly or even privately censure the UAE role in Sudan. And so what we need to see is actually a lot more African solidarity. I travel very often. I go to a lot of different countries in Africa. And I was recently in Gambia at a conference about the future of governance on the continent. And, almost everyone I spoke to, particularly the Africans, didn't know that there was a war of this scale in Sudan. Some of them had heard. And these are people who work in policy, in politics, in governance. And so we really have a problem here where a lot of African media, whether it's print media or television or radio, don't really cover Sudan frequently enough so that people, within Africa, ordinary people, are able to have the knowledge required to ask their own governments to intervene, whether through the African Union or elsewhere. So I really thank you for, hosting me and speaking about Sudan on the show today. But we need to see a lot more of that across the country. Even in the Horn of Africa, when I travel to Ethiopia, to Kenya, people are sort of aware that there's a war going on in Sudan, but they don't have the details. They're not as, conversant in it as people are, for example, on what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening in Gaza. And I think considering that Sudan's the world's largest humanitarian hunger, displacement, and protection crisis, it does warrant that people speak about Sudan as well as all the other conflicts that are going on around the world. I think the UAE it's sort of trying to defend itself by also saying, this is an internal issue and we don't have anything to do with it, which is not true because it's a very globalized war. And it points to everybody else that is also involved in Sudan's war. And we see, for example, that you have countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, of course the UAE, but Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, Russia, all of these countries are almost directly involved in this war. And so I think focusing on the UAE is essential, but we also then have to look at, well, what are all these other countries doing as well? How do they keep this war going? Because just the UAE alone, despite its sort of power in the region and now increasingly globally, and also its direct role in supporting the RSF, it alone is not enough to just sustain this war. This war has a lot of new technology that we're seeing. This war has a lot of money going into it. There are a lot of countries making a killing, frankly, literally and figuratively, in Sudan. We're seeing Ukrainian special forces in Sudan supporting the Sudanese armed forces when Russia was supporting the rapid support forces more openly. We're seeing Turkish drone operators supporting the Sudanese armed forces very much against the support that the United Arab Emirates is giving to the RSF. And that, of course, has implications for Turkey and Emirati sort of competition elsewhere, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, etc. And so what we're seeing in Sudan is effectively now a globalized war that is taking place in Sudan. And to me, the best way I can sort of unpack this for people, especially those who aren't very familiar, is that this war is happening simultaneously at 3 levels. So it's happening at the global international level that I just laid out, with all of these countries having skin in the game, having interests they want to meet through this war rather through a peaceful settlement. You have the national level conflict playing out between the SAF and the RSF, the myriad militias that are on either side, as well as the civilians that support either the SAF project or the RSF project, in as much as they have articulated them. And then you have the local level conflicts between different ethnic groups and different sort of political constituencies that often drive a lot of the violence on the ground, and a lot of also the genocidal acts that we're seeing on the ground are driven by that local violence. So if we're to talk about this war in a way that is constructive, we need to simultaneously be hitting those 3 levels of the conflict at the same time, and not just focusing on one over the other. I think that does a disservice to sort of the complexity of this war, but also the fathomability of this war. It's not too difficult to understand. It's just more complex maybe than your average conflict.
Well, I think they make it more complex intentionally, because when things become complex, it becomes harder to unravel, to fix, to sort out. It's interesting. And on borderlines, we're not afraid to call out people. There is a Sudanese ambassador in Nigeria. Am I correct?
I imagine so, yes.
Yes. Why has he been so quiet? So one of the things that I've said is that we've got to get him in, because the people who are there, whose jobs, who get paid by taxpayers, have to start working for taxpayers. Indeed, you've talked about the weakness of the AU, the African nation. And it reminds me of how so much about us as Africans is not discussed amongst us as Africans. So we're busy looking to the outside, not looking to the inside. Is that because we're afraid to, or is it because we feel like, the African Union is so frankly useless that what is the point?
Well, the African Union is not accountable to us as Africans. I think that's the central problem. The
Yep.
African Union has increasingly become more accountable to foreign interests. And I don't just mean the fact that such a large proportion of its budget, 60% or more, I believe, comes from the West. And only a little, sort of a minority comes from member states, is that, the African Union really serves the interests of the heads of states of member states. It doesn't serve the interests of ordinary people, the publics, the African publics across the continent. And so it becomes a sort of, and I say this, and sometimes people, sort of don't necessarily like it, but the African Union has and IGAD, that's sort of our version of ECOWAS, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which Sudan is a member of. Those two institutions, the AU and IGAD, are sort of social clubs for dictators. They're not about the interests of ordinary people. And so, when we think about what can the African Union do, well, what are they interested in doing, insofar as they are, sort of interested in scratching each other's backs more than, looking after the interests of the people of, for example, in this case, Sudan. And now increasingly they're becoming beholden to Middle Eastern and Gulf powers, who are really the only people who are putting down the kind of investments that the West used to and that China used to. The UAE, for example, here talking about the UAE's role more broadly, the UAE outspends every other country, including China, in African investment. And this goes beyond my region, the Horn of Africa region. It goes all the way across the Sahel, it goes all the way down the sort of Sahelian coast down to, Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa as well. And we're going to see this influence grow because, frankly, these Arab, Gulf petrol-rich states, they have the money to invest. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey's increasingly investing in Africa as well, particularly in Somalia. And so those are the people who African heads of state are increasingly engaging with, partnering with, answering to, over, I think, the interests of ordinary people. And they actually want to have a weak African Union. They disempower the African Union sort of secretariat so that they're not held accountable to any structure, whether it's a domestic one or in sort of a regional one. That is the problem that we face with the African Union. And when it comes to the ambassador that you mentioned, the ambassador in every country that we have now serves the interests of the Sudanese armed forces. We have a military government in Sudan right now. We have two, actually, one by the Sudanese armed forces, one by the rapid support forces, but all the ambassadors belong to the government that is led by the Sudanese armed forces. This is a military that has only ever fought its own people, has only ever killed its own people. It does not fight external wars. It only ever fights internal wars so that it can continue to have to maintain military rule. It is an army that has put together a sort of a civilian cabinet that, frankly, it will not be able to perform because they are merely a facade, a Potemkin government put in place to try and get themselves reinstated, their membership reinstated back into the African Union and some kind of international legitimacy. They are, they are a government, if you want to call them that, who have not declared famine, even though there have been at least 10 hotspots in and across Sudan. These are people who are right now, as we speak, prosecuting and persecuting civil rights and civil society and human rights and activists across the country for daring to lead a revolution in 2018 and 2019 against a military regime. We see the Islamists that very much animate the security structure in Sudan very much making a comeback in ministerial positions in the courts, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so this ambassador absolutely will be serving the junta that is in place in Port Sudan, and any other sort of senior official that is put in place by either the Port Sudan government or the Niala government, the two governments currently vying for power in Sudan, will effectively be a mouthpiece for whichever belligerent party they belong to. So I'm not sure what value necessarily you'll get from this ambassador. Unfortunately, we don't have the Nigerian system where there is some level of accountability of public servants. We simply don't have that. We haven't had that for a long time in Sudan.
Wow. And you all think that we've got problems in Nigeria. Gosh, I'm so. I mean,
I wish we had your problems right now.
I absolutely can imagine. It doesn't sound like, from everything I hear, that you've just told us, which is clearly frank, honest, raw bone accuracy. And that's really what people need to actually wake up to what's going on in Sudan. We've talked about, borderlines. Again, we only talk about issues that happen beyond the borders, Africa, etc. We've had conversations on this show about Congo and Rwanda, etc., etc., way before Trump came in, and then Donald Trump came in, and he claims to have done the peace work, right? So I call it the Trump shallow peace and reconciliation process. In fact, there's no reconciliation, it's just peace. And that's not peace with P-E-A-C-E, it's peace with P-I-E-C-E. Right. Is there a way to actually, albeit it's a nonsense, let's be honest, as Africans, we know it's a nonsense. You come to steal our stuff, you say you're doing peace, but you actually haven't done anything. Is there a way, as Donald Trump gotten involved, is there a way that we can actually utilize his, his transactional mindset, character, to get peace, or at least something for the people to stop the fighting, at the very least, to start with?
Well, I mean, as you say, American peace, as it were, is no longer what it was. And so, a lot of people in sort of the sort of intellectual spaces have been asking, yes, I've been saying we want this war to end, but dare we ask for an American peace, especially under the current conditions? Is that simply going to make things worse? And that's partially because the US has never been, arguably, but certainly now is not very interested in the complexity that I've laid out. Which is that it wants to do, a peace deal between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces very quickly after the Rwanda DRC deal was sort of tied up and sort of finished off. Mazad Boulos, who is Trump's senior advisor for Africa, and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State in the United States, sort of in a press conference said, oh, Sudan is next. We're looking at working on Sudan next. And they have had a sort of a meeting between the ambassadors of Egypt, Saudi, and the United Arab Emirates in the United States, in Washington, D.C., with Chris Landau, who was Marco Rubio's deputy. And they were meant to have a foreign ministers meeting in Washington, D.C. at the end of July, again, with the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. And so the US is sending sort of very mixed signals. They're saying this is an internal conflict, and this is a conflict between the SAF and the RSF. Of course, now it's much broader than that. But at the same time, they have started with the externals. They haven't invited any Sudanese to those initial meetings that they've had. And in the end, the meeting at the end of July was postponed. Actually, now we're hearing it's going to be in late September. And I think that part of the postponement was that the United States recognized that this is actually much more complex than they thought. It is not going to be, a meeting between, as in the DRC Rwanda model, two presidents and then some kind of mineral deal to seal the deal. What you have here are deeply political issues that are very entrenched, issues around justice, issues around the reform of the security sector, issues around deep governance reforms, issues around, civilian versus military sort of governance in Sudan. And those, frankly, cannot be just very quickly sort of chopped and changed in the same way that mineral deals can. The other thing is that, under the Biden administration, we had a lot of working level engagement on Sudan from the State Department. So you had the Conflict and Stabilization Office, the CSO. You had, of course, the Agency of USAID, which is basically the institutional memory of the United States government on Sudan since pretty much the 60s, but certainly since the Bush era. You had an envoy that was put in place by the Biden administration. And so you had a lot of sort of working level engagement, but no senior level engagement. So Biden, I don't think, ever said the word Sudan, at least not publicly. Maybe he did once in his 4 years. His national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, was not really interested in taking on the Sudan file. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, also barely worked on Sudan. And so there was this very sort of there was a sort of a wall between the working level and the senior level staff. Now the Trump administration has the exact opposite problem. We're hearing Trump mention Sudan during that dinner with African heads of state. We're hearing Marco Rubio speaking about Sudan. We're hearing Mazad Boulos speaking about Sudan. And there's a lot of sort of top level, senior level engagement on Washington, at least on speaking about Sudan being a place that needs to be worked on. But now the US has effectively gutted its working level capacity and capability. USAID, institutional memory, is no more. The Conflict and Stabilization Office has also been dissolved. The Office of Sudan and South Sudan which was a holdover from the Bush administration 20 years ago, has also been subsumed into the East Africa office, which means there are actually very few working level people who are able to work on Sudan with any sense of depth and any sense of experience. And so now I think that has sort of, those chickens have come home to roost, and that's why the meeting was delayed. But the other reason the meeting was delayed, which I think is super important to our question of, how global conflict is that they couldn't get agreement with Egypt and the UAE on what a communique would entail, what a sort of announcement at the end of those talks on July 30th would say. And that's because there's a central contention here between Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, which is that even if they sort of agree to come to a peace, even if they agree to push the sides that they support, the SAF and the RSF, towards a peace deal, they have a very different vision about what post-war Sudan looks like. Egypt wants the Sudanese armed forces, which it sees as its security guarantor for the Nile, for its southern border, and with whom it has a decades-long relationship. It wants the Sudanese armed forces to be part and parcel and central to any post-war political dispensation, any government that comes out of a peace deal. The United Arab Emirates' position is that the Sudanese armed forces should not be part of any post-war political dispensation. And that's because it sees the Sudanese armed forces as inherently an Islamist army, one that Bashir sort of created, Bashir being the dictator of 30 years that was unseated in 2018. He crafted this Islamist army out of the Sudanese armed forces, and this was only a few years ago that he left, and so they don't believe that the Sudanese armed forces has been sufficiently de-Islamized, which I would say is true. But this contention, as you can see, has really nothing to do with the Sudanese people. We don't see in any of these conversations what is it the Sudanese people want. Sudanese people do not want Islamists, yes, but they also don't want the UAE and the RSF to run rampage across the country, for the UAE and other countries to buy up Sudan's resources for a sort of dollar sale value. Because there's a war going on and they're able to get pennies on the dollar. These are the kinds of things that people need to be consulted on, and they don't feature anywhere, not in sort of the calculations of the United States, not in the calculations of the African Union or IGAD or Egypt or the UAE. Civilians in Sudan are almost nowhere to be found when these critical conversations about Sudan's future are being had.
I did, one of the things I wrote down was the Islamization of this war or the Islamic angle of it. And I'm glad you mentioned that. But I also wonder if that's part of the deliberate global omission, because whenever Islam is mentioned, it tends to, that whole thing. Do you think that possibly could be one angle that, that's actually preventing people or preventing the international community from making more noise about this?
Well, so this is not about, sort of the role of Islam. This is about Islamism, which is political Islam.
Yeah.
And the Islamists in Sudan had, sort of came into power in 1989. And since that time, they've hosted Osama bin Laden. They have supported what are, sort of designated terrorist groups in the region. They have worked with countries that the West sees as supporting terrorism, as supporting Islamism, countries like Iran, etc. And it's those people under Bashir who really grew Sudan to be this, the country that was designated as state sponsor of terror for about 20 years, a country that was treated with utmost caution. It is, of course, though, the caveat, a country that was actually supporting the United States and Western powers in its global war on terror because of the position that had with all the linkages with all these different quote unquote terrorist groups. And so where I think the half truth, or at least the very unconvincing position for the United Arab Emirates, is that they say, we don't want to see the Islamists in power. We don't want to support the Islamists. We don't want to support the Sudanese armed forces because they're all Islamists. But if that's true, why is it that the United Arab Emirates has been supporting the Bashir regime for the longest time? They supported the coup of al-Burhan in 2021, and they have been supporting Sudan under Islamist rule for a long time. They grew the economic portfolio with Sudan, an Islamist Sudan, for a very long time. They have always been against a civilian Sudan. They've always been against a democratic Sudan, very much in favor of the strong man politics, even if that strong man is an Islamist. So for a lot of us in Sudan, we find that justification very difficult to swallow. And even if the United Arab Emirates has this more regional anti-Islamist position, we see that in Libya, we see it in Yemen, we also see it in Somalia. it's in Sudan, it's far less convincing because of the history. But for a lot of us in Sudan, the Islamism issue is of genuine concern because we know what the Islamists will do to us.
Mm.
We have seen Islamic repression for decades. We have seen personal sort of public order laws that talk about the lengths of women's skirts and whether they wear, scarves, headscarves in public or not. The ones that sort of dictate the lives of people, particularly minorities, particularly women. We've seen the Islamists really sort of persecute and prosecute people it doesn't like, civil rights defenders, human rights defenders, people from ethnic groups that it doesn't like, or minorities like Christians that it doesn't like. The whole reason we have a country called South Sudan is because the Islamists made it impossible for the people of what is now South Sudan to remain a part of the country as equal citizens. We have seen the Islamists very much hand in hand with the Sudanese armed forces wage campaigns against groups in what is now South Sudan, groups in Darfur, ethnic groups in Blue Nile, ethnic groups across the Kordofans, as well as groups in Eastern Sudan. This is a sort of a political movement that makes it very difficult for the unity of Sudan and the oneness of Sudan to really take root. And so there is this sort of, what we're afraid of is that once you say Islamism, people start treating Sudan as a security file because of what this means. Jihadism, etc. That's not what we want to see. We want people to reckon with the real, sort of real life implications of what Islamist rule looks like, but we also don't want the Sudanese file to be overly securitized because that always minimizes the role that civilians can play.
Indeed. Talk to us about what, one of the things that I said actually before I go to this question, one of the things that I talked about in my introduction was the lack of funds from the UN and how there just isn't any fun, and it's not even that Sudan should have to depend on the UN, but the people have no choice. Talk to us about what kind of fund is now coming in to actually help the displacements, the hunger, and the normal people, the people who have been affected on ground.
Well, Sudan is no, different to a lot of African contexts in this way, and actually a lot of global contexts where it's actually the diaspora that sends a lot of remittances home, much more than what Sudan gets in global aid, both before this war and now during it. But there's a very real reality that we're contending with here, which is that out of the international actors, it was the United States that was the sort of giving the lion's share of humanitarian aid to Sudan. And with the cuts to USAID, followed then by the dissolution of USAID altogether, so the Sudanese humanitarian response plan, both at the UN and outside of it, has completely suffered, and no other country has taken up made the difference. Now, of course, immediately you think two things. One, what about these Arab countries that are very much part and parcel of waging this war? They could, with a stroke of a pen, pay much more than even what the US is doing. They could cover the entirety of the $4 billion and change humanitarian response plan in Sudan very, very easily, but they choose not to. Whatever aid they do choose to give is very much politically mediated and through their own channels. The second thing is, well, Sudan also has its own resources. So why is Sudan reliant on international aid when it has, gold, it has minerals, it has land, it has all of these resources that it's able to effectively exploit for the good of its own citizens? That is something we should be looking at. But all this gold that is coming out of both SAF areas and RSF areas, most of which goes to the UAE, is there a way we can access some of those financial flows and create a trust fund for Sudan that is independent of, the charity or lack thereof of the West, which is what the UN model is reliant on? That is what we need to be looking at. But if we're just looking at the UN response, it's been very, very poor since the start of the war. We have successive yearly funds, annual funds whose targets have not been met, and this year is the least. Even though this year we've had the most needs. You have half the country in need of humanitarian aid. You have 18 million people in severe, hunger and food insecurity. You have 19 million children out of school, almost no health facilities, and you have a famine that is only going to continue. And people often think, well, what about getting aid through? Access has been a huge constraint. Both the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces are blocking aid in various different ways, whether bureaucratically or physically. And what we've seen is that, the Sudanese armed forces won't declare a famine. The Sudanese armed forces is considered by the UN to be sort of the de facto authorities. If they were to declare a famine, we would see this mechanism, this international mechanism kick in, and we would see, a lot of food sort of being able to flood and sort of new different ways, new operating procedures being put into place to feed people. We're not seeing that. And the UN is effectively letting belligerents dictate the terms of aid. So the UN very much is complicit in all of this. This is going to, this is causing a lot of people to frankly needlessly die because of this. One such epicenter right now, as we speak, is Al Fashir. And the pictures that we're seeing coming out of Al Fashir are, some of the worst that we've seen, not just in Sudan, but globally, I would say for about 40 years. Famine experts say that the scale of the famine in Sudan, Gaza is the sort of the world's most intense food insecurity and famine condition. But in terms of scale, it is Sudan where you have the largest famine, frankly, because of the sheer, the number of people. And that famine that we're seeing right now is, unlike ones we have seen for 40 years, pretty much since the Ethiopian East African famine from the mid-1980s. And yet we see no response. We don't see any sort of celebrities chime in. We don't see a UN response. We don't see a state-led response. We live in a vastly different world to the one in the mid-80s, but still you would expect some level of human compassion for this war. And part of that complexity we spoke earlier, I think here is playing a role. So oftentimes we hear from the UN, it's very difficult to navigate access, very difficult to negotiate access for, but there are people on the ground working. And here I want to pinpoint a very important trend that we have seen in the war. And one of very few things I think that give people hope. I know we've spent almost, the better part of an hour really talking about very, very horrible things. But the one bright spark, the one silver lining in all of this is what I spoke about at the outset of this interview, which is that Sudanese people coming together and helping each other. And so we've seen these mutual
the grassroots,
coming together. The ones I think are best known now are the emergency response rooms, which formed from the pro-democracy actors that unseated Bashir in 2019, and they've now been nominated for a Nobel Prize, I believe, earlier this year. And
fantastic!
Absolutely, from overtly political work to humanitarian work. They've run aid kitchens, they've evacuated people, they've given women and children and men who have been raped the right kind of care. They have supported different groups of people to withstand the sieges and to withstand, the horrible repression that they have faced under the rapid support forces, and they're helping people now to keep the faith in the revolution and in sort of democratic Sudan during this time that the Sudanese armed forces is prosecuting people and taking them to kangaroo courts. They're a very important backbone of the Sudanese war effort and not very often spoken about. But they are leading the lion's share. They're getting a lot of money, thankfully, from the diaspora, or rather I should say they're getting most of their money from the diaspora, but it's nowhere near enough to reach the needs of people. And the international community and international global aid systems are just too sclerotic and too, difficult to shift to be able to support and fund the kinds of groups, the kinds of mutual aid groups that we're seeing, but they're absolutely doing God's work.
We need them on the show. Please, Benga will be in touch with you, my producer, to book a time, to get their contacts, to book a time. Absolutely. We need to laud what they are doing, because that's Africans working for Africa. Wants to support them. Yes.
Absolutely. And if anybody wants to support them, they can go to Mutual Aid Sudan or Sudan Solidarity Collective. Both of those websites have buttons you can press to donate. Anything large or small will help. Excellent. And it goes straight into hungry people on the ground in Sudan.
Excellent. That gives me hope. That's a wonderful way to get people to call. So I think I understand. Absolutely. Yeah, I think I understand the female line is working. You can all call the female line if you have any questions or comments. 0201-465-7190 or WhatsApp on 0809-597-5805. And I don't have we've got 4 minutes? Less than 4 minutes actually remaining. Okay, they're calling. Let me try and squeeze in a couple of calls. Hello.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Emmanuel. Go ahead.
Yeah. My questions are, some of us thought that the RSF led by Dagalo, if I'm not mistaken his name, was a ragtag army. They were going to blink. But it's unfortunate that he lingered for too long. What will the war look like in the next 2 years if perhaps there is no stop? to the war because of the complexity of it that your guest has laid out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a good question. What will Sudan look like in the next few years if there's no end to this war? That's from Emmanuel. He's a regular caller. When my regulars are not calling, I know something is wrong with the line.
Well, I mean, the short answer is it will get very, very bad. It will get much, much worse than it currently is. I mean, right now, Sudan is sort of meeting all the superlatives, the worst of everything that we're seeing right now. And it will get much, much worse. We're talking about, there's some studies that are projected 12 million people could die of famine. That's an incredible number of people sort of in the next few years if harvests continue to fail, if aid continues not to be able to get in, and if these mutual aid groups continue to be facing repression from the SAF and the RSF, from the army and the rapid support forces. And very important to know that these groups, they are modeling what the Sudanese state could look like. So we also know how things could look like if they improve. We also know what it look like if Sudan goes in a different direction.
We've got, what have I got? 1.5 minutes. Let me ask you something. I want you to leave us with action plan. What we Africans, Nigerians, diasporans, what we can do and how we can do it. Whether it's social media, money, whatever. Oh, now they call. Why do you people call late? I don't have the time. Bear with me 1 second, Kholood. 1 second. 10 seconds, I'm going to give each of them hello. Why are you calling late? Hello, quickly.
I'm sorry, Cecilia.
Very quickly. 10 seconds.
Yes. I don't know if your guest, good evening, ma'am, if she has a knowledge of, I know there's oil in Sudan, and with the war, and I don't know other minerals, if you can list some of them, that's the Americans, the Europeans, they still extract those things even with the war going on. Am I right?
Okay, good question. Right. He wants to know about the oil and the minerals. Are the Chinese still extracting? Okay. I was trying to pick up the second call, but sorry, you cut off. Okay, it's ringing again. 10 seconds, people. Hello, quickly.
Hello, Titi. Yeah, good evening. How are you doing?
Very well, Titi. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Finally, like Libya, like Sudan, we are seeing the same factional leadership in Libya. The same thing is happening in Sudan. And we have the same international actors backing the problem in Libya, and the same thing happening in
Titi Lokwe, I'm going to have to cut you off quickly.
Yes. So the question now is that, can we say Sudan, just like Libya, is going to be a failed state?
Okay. Right. Are we near a point where Sudan could end up being a failed state? I have to give you 10 seconds. It's crazy. I've got 20 seconds left. They call so late.
Okay. So on the first question, China has a 100-year foreign policy. It's willing to wait this war out, but it backs the Sudanese armed forces because it sees them as a state. However, Chinese-made weapons are making their way into the hands of the rapid support forces through the United Arab Emirates. On the second question was about.
Oh, we've gone out of time. Why do you people call late?
Coming up. We'll be back in a moment.
Okay, can I do this? Right. We'll be back in a moment. Right. Okay.
.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99